When justice fails and hope dies, sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. In the dusty streets of Ironwood Crossing, a heavy-set widow named Miriam Hale was being dragged through the dirt by her own family, beaten for the crime of birthing twin daughters instead of sons. The townspeople watched in silence as her brothers-in-law prepared to cast her out into the wilderness with 2 newborn babies. But from the shadows emerged a scarred mountain man who would change everything with 4 simple words: "I will be their father." This is a story of courage, family, and the lengths one man will go to protect the innocent. Stay with me until the very end of this tale and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories of hope and redemption travel around the world. The sun hung mercilessly over Ironwood Crossing that September morning in 1887, casting long shadows between the weathered buildings that lined the main thoroughfare. The heat shimmered off the packed earth streets, and most decent folks had already retreated indoors to escape the blazing Arizona sun. But decency was in short supply that day, as evidenced by the crowd gathering near the old mercantile. At the center of the commotion stood Miriam Hale, 24 years old, and still bearing the exhaustion of recent childbirth. Her auburn hair, normally kept in a neat bun, had come loose and hung in damp strands around her flushed face. She clutched 2 tiny bundles against her ample bosom, twin daughters born just 3 days prior. The babies were so small they seemed to disappear in the folds of their mother's worn calico dress. "You brought shame on the Hale name," shouted Thomas Hale, her deceased husband's eldest brother. His weathered face was twisted with disgust as he pointed an accusatory finger at the exhausted woman. "Jacob's been dead 6 months, and you couldn't even give him sons to carry on his legacy." Samuel Hale, the younger brother, spat tobacco juice into the dust near Miriam's feet. "Twins, no less. Everyone knows twin girls are bad luck. You've cursed this whole town with your weakness." Miriam's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of desperation. "Please, Thomas. Samuel, these are Jacob's children too. They're your nieces. Surely you can't mean to..." "Mean to what?" Thomas's voice rose, and several townspeople stopped their morning routines to stare. "Cast out a woman who's brought nothing but misfortune. You're damn right we mean it." The crowd began to murmur among themselves. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house shook her gray head sadly, but made no move to intervene. Old Pete, who ran the livery stable, found sudden interest in examining his boots. Even Reverend Morrison, who should have spoken for Christian charity, remained silent on the church steps, his hands clasped behind his back. Miriam's legs trembled beneath her considerable weight as she struggled to remain standing. The birth had been difficult. Twin deliveries always were, and she'd lost more blood than was safe. Dark circles ringed her green eyes, and her normally rosy complexion had taken on a grayish pallor. "Jacob left me the land," she said, her voice growing stronger despite her physical weakness. "The deed is in my name now. You can't just..." Samuel's harsh laugh cut through her words. "That worthless patch of scrub. You think that matters? Look at yourself, woman. You're as wide as a barn door and twice as useless. What's a fat widow gonna do with 40 acres and a dried-up well? It's not dried up." Miriam protested, shifting the babies to better support their weight. "The spring still runs clear and cold. Jacob always said..." "Jacob's dead," Thomas roared, stepping closer until his whiskey-scented breath washed over her face. "And these girl children ain't worth the food it'll take to feed them. Town's got no use for another mouth to feed, especially not 3 of them." The crowd pressed closer, and Miriam could feel the hostility radiating from some of the faces surrounding her. Fear began to replace exhaustion as she realized how alone she truly was. "My husband served this town faithfully," she said, trying to project strength she didn't feel. "He was your deputy for 3 years, Thomas. Surely that counts for something." "It counted for something when he was alive," Samuel sneered. "But now you're just dead weight, and those babies..." He gestured dismissively at the tiny forms in her arms. Twin girls are an omen of bad times coming. Everyone knows that. A murmur of agreement rippled through parts of the crowd. Superstition ran deep in these frontier towns, and twin births were often viewed with suspicion, especially when no husband was present to provide for them. "Where will we go?" Miriam asked, her voice breaking slightly. "The babies are only 3 days old. They need shelter warmth." "That's your problem now, ain't it?" Thomas grabbed her upper arm roughly, his fingers digging into the soft flesh. "Should have thought of that before you spread your legs, and that's enough." The voice came from somewhere behind the crowd, deep, gravelly, and carrying an authority that made several people turn around. The speaker stepped forward slowly, and the crowd parted instinctively to let him pass. Ezekiel Brandt stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, and hands that looked like they could crush stones. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and a jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a memento from a knife fight years earlier. He wore simple clothes, dark wool pants, a cotton shirt rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle, and boots that had seen countless miles of rough country. But it was his eyes that made people step back. They were the color of winter sky, pale blue and utterly cold when his temper was roused. Right now they were fixed on Thomas Hale with an intensity that made the smaller man's bluster falter. "I said that's enough." Ezekiel repeated, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet street. "You want to have words with a woman who just gave birth? You do it with some respect." Thomas tried to puff up his chest, but he had to crane his neck to meet Ezekiel's gaze. "This ain't your concern, mountain man. This is family business." "Is it?" Ezekiel's eyes swept over the crowd before settling on Miriam. She was swaying slightly on her feet, and he could see the exhaustion and fear in her face. The babies in her arms were so still they might have been dolls, but he caught the slight movement of their tiny chests rising and falling. "Family business usually doesn't require an audience," he continued, gesturing at the gathered townspeople. "Looks more like a public shaming to me." Samuel stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "You'd best move along, Brandt. This doesn't concern you." Ezekiel's smile was thin and held no warmth. Funny thing about concerned Samuel, they have a way of expanding when a man sees something that offends his sense of right and wrong. "Right and wrong." Thomas laughed, but there was nervousness in it now. "What would you know about family responsibility? You live up in those mountains like some kind of hermit. When's the last time you even talked to a woman, much less understood what it means to provide for children?" The words hit their target, and for a moment something flickered across Ezekiel's face. Pain, perhaps, or old regret. But it was gone so quickly that most of the crowd missed it entirely. "I know enough to recognize when 2 grown men are picking on someone who can't fight back," he said quietly. "I also know that Jacob Hale was worth 10 of either of you, and if he was here right now, he'd plant you both face first in the dirt for treating his wife this way." Miriam looked up at this stranger who was defending her confusion, and hope warring in her expression. She'd seen him around town occasionally, always alone, always quiet, conducting his business quickly before disappearing back into the mountains. She knew his name from whispered conversations in the general store, but she'd never spoken to him directly. "Jacob's not here," Thomas said, his voice rising again. "And this woman needs to learn her place. She's got no husband, no prospects, and now she's saddled with 2 girl babies that'll never amount to anything. The charitable thing would be to put those infants out of their misery and send her packing before she becomes a burden on the whole town." The casual cruelty of the words hit Miriam like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her grip tightening protectively around her daughters. The babies, as if sensing their mother's distress, began to whimper softly. That sound, those tiny, helpless cries, seemed to flip a switch inside Ezekiel Brandt. His face went utterly still, and when he moved, it was with the fluid grace of a predator closing in on its prey. He closed the distance between himself and Thomas in 3 long strides, moving so quickly that the other man barely had time to register the threat before Ezekiel's hand shot out and grabbed him by the throat. "Say that again," Ezekiel said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow more threatening than any shout. "I want to make sure I heard you correctly." Thomas's eyes bulged as Ezekiel's fingers tightened slightly around his windpipe. He clawed at the mountain man's wrist, but it was like trying to bend iron. Let go. Did you just suggest murdering 2 babies? Ezekiel's voice was still quiet, conversational even, but every person in the crowd could hear the deadly intent beneath the calm surface. "Because that's what it sounded like to me." Samuel's hand moved toward his gun, but Ezekiel's free hand shot out with lightning speed, grabbing the younger Hale brother's wrist before he could draw the weapon. "I wouldn't," Ezekiel said, glancing at Samuel without loosening his grip on Thomas. "Not unless you want to explain to Sheriff Morrison why you drew on a man who was having a conversation." You're strangling my brother," Samuel gasped, trying unsuccessfully to free his gun hand. "No," Ezekiel said calmly. "If I was strangling him, he'd be unconscious by now. This is just emphasis." He released Thomas suddenly, causing the man to stumble backward and crash into a water trough. Samuel, freed as well, immediately went for his gun again, but found himself staring down the barrel of Ezekiel's Colt .45 before his own weapon had cleared leather. "Like I said," Ezekiel murmured, his gun steady as a rock. "I wouldn't." The crowd had gone completely silent now, sensing that the confrontation had escalated beyond mere words. Several people began backing away, not wanting to be caught in crossfire if shooting started. Miriam watched in amazement as this stranger, this mountain hermit, faced down 2 armed men to defend her. She'd never seen such controlled violence, such quiet confidence in the face of danger. Her babies had stopped crying as if they too sensed that their protector had arrived. "Now then," Ezekiel said, his gun still trained on Samuel, while his eyes flicked between both brothers. "I think we need to have a different conversation, one that starts with you 2 apologizing to Mrs. Hale for your behavior." Thomas was still coughing and rubbing his throat, but his eyes burned with humiliation and rage. "You have no right. I have every right that any decent man has when he sees cruelty being practiced on the defenseless." Ezekiel cut him off. "The question is whether you're going to continue making this difficult, or whether you're going to remember that you're supposed to be civilized human beings." "She's family," Samuel said, his voice tight with anger, but his hands carefully visible and empty. "What happens to her is our decision to make." "Is it?" Ezekiel holstered his gun in one smooth motion, but his stance remained ready for trouble. "Because from where I stand, it looks like Mrs. Hale is a grown woman, a property owner, and the mother of 2 children who deserve better than what you're offering." He turned to look at Miriam directly for the first time, and she was struck by the kindness in those pale blue eyes, such a contrast to the cold fury he'd directed at her tormentors. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully, "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Ezekiel Brandt." "Miriam Hale," she managed, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened in the last few minutes. "And these are my daughters." Ezekiel looked down at the tiny bundles in her arms, and something in his expression softened even further. "They're beautiful," he said simply. "What are their names?" The question caught Miriam off guard. In all the chaos and cruelty of the past few days, no one had asked about her daughters as individuals, as people with names and futures and infinite potential. I haven't named them yet," she admitted quietly. "Jacob and I had picked out boys' names, and when they turned out to be girls." She trailed off, glancing nervously at Thomas and Samuel. "Well," Ezekiel said, "I reckon that's a decision that should be made by their mother in her own time without anyone else's interference." The simple statement carried profound weight. Here was a man acknowledging her right to make decisions about her own children, something her own family had been denying her. Thomas had recovered enough to rejoin the confrontation, though he kept a safe distance from Ezekiel. "This is all very touching," he said sarcastically, "but it doesn't change the facts. She can't support those babies. She's got no income, no prospects, and winter's coming. The merciful thing, Ezekiel interrupted, would be for her family to help her through a difficult time instead of throwing her out like garbage." "Help her how?" Samuel demanded. "We've got our own families to worry about, our own mouths to feed. We can't take on 3 more, especially when one of them is—" He gestured vaguely at Miriam's substantial figure. "When one of them is what?" Ezekiel's voice dropped to that dangerous whisper again. Samuel seemed to realize he was on thin ice. "When one of them requires considerable resources," he finished lamely. Miriam felt her cheeks burn with shame. She'd always been a large woman. Even as a young girl, she'd been what people politely called big-boned. After her pregnancy and the recent birth, she was heavier than she'd ever been, and she was acutely aware of how she must look to these people. But Ezekiel stepped closer to her, positioning himself slightly between her and the crowd. "Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice gentle but carrying clearly in the quiet street. "Do you have somewhere safe to go? Someone who can help you and your daughters?" The question laid bare the depth of her isolation. Miriam looked around at the faces surrounding her, some hostile, some merely curious, but none offering sanctuary. "The church," she said hesitantly. "Perhaps Reverend Morrison." All eyes turned to the preacher, who had remained conspicuously silent throughout the confrontation. He shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny, his hands still clasped behind his back. "Well," Morrison said finally, his voice carefully neutral, "the church is always open to those in need, of course, but we have limited resources, and with winter approaching—" He trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging. "Limited resources," Ezekiel repeated flatly. "For a woman and 2 newborn babies." Morrison's face flushed. "We do what we can, but charity must be balanced with practical considerations. The congregation has its own families to think of." "I see." Ezekiel looked around at the assembled townspeople, his gaze lingering on each face. "So let me understand this correctly. A woman who was married to your deputy, a man who risked his life to keep this town safe, finds herself widowed and in need of help, and the response from his family is to cast her out, and the response from his community is to turn their backs." The shame in the silence that followed was palpable. Several people looked down at their feet, unable to meet Ezekiel's steady gaze. "That about sum it up," he continued. "It's not that simple," Mrs. Henderson said defensively. "We all have our own troubles. Times are hard for everyone. Ezekiel's voice was mild, but there was steel beneath it, hard enough that basic human decency becomes a luxury you can't afford. Thomas stepped forward again, his pride apparently overriding his common sense. Easy words from a man who lives alone in the mountains and never has to worry about anyone but himself. What do you know about responsibility, about providing for a family? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Ezekiel went very still, and for a moment something raw and painful flickered across his features. "More than you might think," he said quietly. Then, without warning, he turned to face Miriam fully. She looked up at him with tired, frightened eyes, still clutching her daughters protectively against her chest. "Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice carrying a weight of decision that seemed to surprise even him. "Would you and your daughters accept my protection?" The question sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. Miriam blinked in confusion, not certain she'd heard correctly. I don't understand," she stammered. Ezekiel took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his words rang out clear and strong enough for every person in the street to hear. "I'm asking if you'll let me be a father to those girls." The silence that followed was so complete that the only sounds were the distant lowing of cattle and the soft whisper of wind through the buildings. Miriam stared at him in shock, her mouth slightly open. "You... what?" Thomas sputtered. "You can't just... you don't even know her." "I know enough," Ezekiel said without taking his eyes off Miriam. "I know she's been treated shamefully by people who should be protecting her. I know she's got 2 babies who need a father's care and provision, and I know that sometimes a man has to step up and do what's right, even when it's not convenient or comfortable." Miriam's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "Mr. Brandt, you don't know what you're saying. You don't know me or my circumstances or—" "I know you need help," he said simply, "and I know I have the means to provide it, a house-land income from my trapping and lumber work. More importantly, I have the will to protect you and your daughters from anyone who would harm you." He gestured toward the Hale brothers, including family members who've forgotten what family means. Samuel was shaking his head in disbelief. "This is insane. You can't just adopt someone else's children because you feel sorry for them." "Watch me," Ezekiel said calmly. He turned back to Miriam, his expression gentle but serious. "I'm not asking for an answer right now, Mrs. Hale. You've been through enough today, and decisions like this shouldn't be made under pressure. But I want you to know that the offer is real, and it comes with no conditions except that you and your daughters be treated with the respect and care you deserve." Tears had begun streaming down Miriam's face, tears of relief, confusion, hope, and overwhelming gratitude. For the first time in days, someone was offering her a future that didn't involve shame, poverty, and desperation. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for strangers?" Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as if he were looking into the past. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and hard-won wisdom, because sometimes the people who need family the most are the ones who've had it taken away from them, and sometimes the people who can provide it are the ones who've learned to live without it. He looked down at the babies in her arms, and his expression grew tender. Those little girls deserve to grow up knowing they're wanted, protected, and loved. If their blood family won't provide that, then maybe it's time to build a different kind of family. The crowd was beginning to murmur among themselves, some in shock, others in grudging admiration for the mountain man's unexpected proposal. But Thomas Hale was far from finished. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "You can't waltz into town and steal another man's family just because you've got some misguided sense of chivalry." Ezekiel turned to face him, and his voice carried the weight of absolute finality. "I'm not stealing anything, Thomas. I'm offering what you've already thrown away. The question is whether Mrs. Hale wants to accept it." "And what about the land?" Samuel demanded. "That spring belongs to the Hale family by rights. Jacob may have deeded it to her, but family property should stay in the family." "The deed says otherwise," Ezekiel replied. "And unless Mrs. Hale chooses to sell or transfer it, that land belongs to her and her daughters. Her daughters who would be your daughters if she accepts this insane proposal," Thomas said, his voice rising in frustration. "You'd have control over Hale property through marriage to this... Careful," Ezekiel said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper again. "Very careful how you finish that sentence." Thomas wisely fell silent, but his face was purple with rage and humiliation. Reverend Morrison finally found his voice again. "This is all highly irregular," he said uncertainly. "Marriage is a sacred institution, not something to be entered into lightly or for practical reasons." "Who said anything about marriage?" Ezekiel asked, raising an eyebrow. "I offered to be a father to those children. There are legal ways to do that without involving matrimony." The distinction seemed to catch several people off guard, including Miriam herself. She looked up at him with new confusion. "Adoption," he explained gently. "Legal guardianship. ways to give those girls my name and my protection without requiring anything from you except permission. But people would talk, Mrs. Henderson said, clearly flustered. A single woman living with a single man, even if there's that is, even if it's purely for the children's welfare. People are already talking, Ezekiel pointed out. The question is whether they're talking about how this community failed one of its own or how it came together to protect the vulnerable. He looked around at the faces surrounding them, his gaze challenging each person to examine their own conscience. Besides, he added with a slight smile, I've been the subject of gossip for years. Living alone in the mountains tends to make folks creative with their theories about a man's character and habits. I'm not much worried about what people say behind my back. Miriam found herself almost smiling at that despite everything. There was something both reassuring and amusing about his matter-of-fact acceptance of his reputation as the town's mysterious hermit. Think about it, Mrs. Hale. Ezekiel said, his voice growing serious again. You don't have to decide today or tomorrow or even next week. But know that the offer stands. Those girls deserve a chance at a good life, and I'd be honored to help provide it. One of the babies chose that moment to begin crying, a thin, hungry wail that reminded everyone present just how vulnerable and dependent these children were. Miriam automatically began rocking her arms gently, making soft shushing sounds. They need to be fed, she said quietly, exhaustion creeping back into her voice as the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade. Then let's get them somewhere safe and warm, Ezekiel said. He turned to address the crowd. I think this conversation has run its course. Mrs. Hale and her daughters need rest and care, not more public spectacle. He offered Miriam his arm for support. May I escort you to the church, ma'am, Reverend Morrison? I trust you can find somewhere appropriate for a new mother and her babies to rest. Put on the spot so directly Morrison could hardly refuse. Of course, the vestry has a small room that should suffice temporarily. Temporarily, Ezekiel repeated, making it clear he expected something more permanent to be arranged soon. As Miriam accepted his support and they began walking toward the church, Thomas Hale called after them. This isn't over, Brandt. Those babies are Hale's, and that land belongs to the family. We won't let some mountain hermit steal what's rightfully ours. Ezekiel paused and looked back over his shoulder. It's over when Mrs. Hale says it's over, Thomas, not before. Then he continued walking, his tall frame sheltering Miriam and her daughters from the hostile stares that followed them down the street. Behind them the crowd began to disperse, but the conversations that started up were anything but quiet. The mountain man had just thrown down a gauntlet that would change everything in Ironwood Crossing. The question now was whether the town would rise to meet the challenge of protecting its most vulnerable members, or whether the forces of greed and prejudice would prevail. But as Ezekiel helped Miriam up the church steps, one thing was certain: those twin baby girls would not face their uncertain future alone. Whatever came next, they would have a protector willing to stand against the world to keep them safe. And in a frontier town where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers, that might just be enough to change everything. Sao Tum, Lu E Traloi Chung Muk Tinyang, Kong Ye Sang Muk Document Modifier. The church vestry smelled of old wood polish and lingering incense, a comforting contrast to the harsh sunlight and hostile voices they'd left behind in the street. Ezekiel helped Miriam settle into the single wooden chair, noting how she winced slightly as she sat down. The difficult birth was still taking its toll on her body, and the confrontation with the Hale brothers had drained what little strength she'd managed to recover. The babies need feeding, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The twins had begun fussing again, their tiny faces scrunched up in hunger and discomfort. Of course, Ezekiel said, turning toward the door. I'll give you privacy. Wait! The word escaped Miriam's lips before she could stop it. When he turned back, she saw understanding in his pale blue eyes. "You're afraid they'll come back," he said. It wasn't a question. Miriam nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "Thomas has a temper when he's been drinking, and Samuel does whatever Thomas tells him to do. If they think you've left me alone." "Then I'll stay right outside this door," Ezekiel said firmly. "Anyone who wants to disturb you will have to go through me first." The simple promise brought tears to Miriam's eyes again. When was the last time someone had offered to protect her? Even Jacob, bless his memory, had been gentle and kind, but never particularly strong. He'd been a scholar who'd taken the deputy position because the town needed someone who could read and write well, not because he was a fighter. "Thank you," she whispered. Ezekiel tipped his hat and stepped outside, pulling the door almost closed behind him. Through the narrow gap, Miriam could see his broad shoulders as he positioned himself in the hallway, and she found herself feeling safer than she had in months. As she began nursing her daughters, Miriam allowed herself to really think about what had just happened. A stranger, a man she'd barely spoken to before today, had just offered to become a father to her children. The magnitude of it was overwhelming. She'd heard stories about Ezekiel Brandt, of course. Everyone in Ironwood Crossing had. He'd arrived in the territory about 5 years ago, purchasing a tract of mountain land that nobody else wanted because it was too remote and difficult to farm. He'd built himself a cabin up there and made a living trapping, hunting, and occasionally bringing lumber down to sell in town. Some folks said he was running from something. Maybe the law, maybe a woman, maybe just the demons that seemed to follow some men back from the war. Others claimed he was touched in the head, choosing to live like a hermit when he could have had a normal life in town. But nobody disputed that he was capable, honest in his dealings, and kept to himself. What nobody had ever suggested was that he might be the kind of man who would risk his own safety to defend a stranger's family. The babies settled as they fed, their tiny hands curling against her chest. Looking down at them, Miriam felt the familiar surge of fierce love mixed with terrifying responsibility. These little girls were completely dependent on her for everything: food, warmth, protection, a future. And until today, she'd had no idea how she was going to provide any of those things. Jacob's death had been sudden, a heart attack while he was walking his evening rounds. At 26, he'd seemed too young for such a thing, but the doctor said it sometimes happened, especially to men who'd been weakened by childhood illnesses. Jacob had been sickly as a boy, which was probably why he'd grown up preferring books to physical activities. They'd been happy together, she and Jacob. Not passionately in love, perhaps, but comfortable and content. He'd married her despite her size, despite the whispered comments about how a scholarly man like him could do better than a fat merchant's daughter. He'd been kind to her, respectful, and genuinely excited about becoming a father. But now Jacob was gone, and his brothers had made their feelings about her clear. She was a burden they didn't want to bear, and her daughters were disappointments they'd rather forget existed. The sound of voices in the hallway outside made her tense, but she recognized Ezekiel's deep tones and relaxed slightly. She couldn't make out the words, but his voice remained calm and measured, not the angry whisper it had become when facing down Thomas and Samuel. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock on the door. "Miss Hale, Reverend Morrison has brought some supplies." Miriam quickly adjusted her clothing and called for them to enter. Morrison came in carrying a tray with a pitcher of water, some bread, and what looked like a jar of preserves. Behind him, Ezekiel carried a bundle of clean linens. "Thank you," Miriam said gratefully. She was parched, and the bread made her stomach rumble with hunger. She'd been so focused on the baby's needs that she'd barely eaten in days. "The ladies of the congregation will be organizing more substantial assistance," Morrison said, though his tone suggested this was more hope than certainty. "In the meantime, this room is yours for as long as you need it." "That's very generous," Miriam replied, though she noticed he'd carefully avoided promising anything specific or long-term. After Morrison left, Ezekiel lingered in the doorway. "How are they doing?" he asked, nodding toward the babies. "Better now that they've eaten." Miriam looked down at her daughters who had fallen asleep in her arms. "They're so small. Jacob was hoping for sons, but when I saw them—" She trailed off, smiling softly. "I couldn't imagine loving anything more." "Have you given any thought to names?" The question reminded her of how surreal this whole situation was. Here she sat discussing her newborn daughters with a man who'd just offered to become their father, as if this were the most natural conversation in the world. "I've been thinking about it," she admitted. "Jacob's mother was named Sarah, and my grandmother was Elizabeth. I thought maybe Sarah and Elizabeth, strong names. Ezekiel approved, biblical. Reverend Morrison would appreciate that." There was a comfortable silence as they both watched the sleeping babies. Then Ezekiel spoke again, his voice careful and gentle. "Mrs. Hale, I want you to know that my offer earlier wasn't made lightly or in the heat of the moment. I've been thinking about it for some time now." Miriam looked up at him in surprise. "You've been thinking about adopting children, but you didn't even know I was pregnant until recently." "Not adopting your children specifically," Ezekiel clarified, "but the idea of family, of having something more than just myself to care about." He moved into the room and sat down heavily on a wooden crate, suddenly looking older than his 30-some years. "I haven't always lived alone, Mrs. Hale. I was married once back in Missouri. My wife she was everything good in the world. Smart, kind, beautiful. We were planning to start a family." Miriam heard the past tense and felt her heart sink. "What happened? Cholera," he said simply. "Swept through our county in the summer of '79. Took her and our son. He was just 6 months old." The raw pain in Persina's voice made Miriam's throat tighten with sympathy. "I'm so sorry." Ezekiel nodded, his hands clasped tightly together. "After that, I couldn't stay in that place around all those memories. So I came west, found this piece of land where nobody knew me or my history. Thought if I lived quietly enough, simply enough, maybe the hurt would fade." "Has it?" Miriam asked softly. "Some," he admitted. "But lately I've been realizing that avoiding pain isn't the same thing as healing from it. And watching what happened to you today, seeing those beautiful babies who need protection." He looked up at her with those pale blue eyes. "Maybe it's time I stopped running from the idea of family and started building one instead." The honesty of his confession left Miriam speechless for a moment. Here was a man who'd suffered devastating loss, but was willing to risk his heart again for the sake of 2 tiny strangers. "Mr. Brandt," she began hesitantly, "what you're offering, it's incredibly generous, but you should know that I come with complications beyond just the babies." "What kind of complications?" Miriam took a deep breath, steeling herself to lay out all the reasons why accepting his help might not be wise. The land, for one thing. Thomas wasn't lying when he said it's valuable. The spring that runs through the property is the only reliable water source for miles around. Jacob always said it was worth more than the rest of the farm combined. And you think the Hale brothers will fight for it? I know they will. They've been pressuring me to sign it over to them since before Jacob was even buried. They claim it should stay in the family name, but really they want to control the water rights. If I marry you, if you adopt the girls, that land becomes part of your holdings. They'll see that as theft. Ezekiel was quiet for a moment, considering this. How much land are we talking about? 40 acres with the house and barn. Jacob said the water rights alone could be worth thousands of dollars if the territory ever grows large enough to need them. And you're worried that I'm interested in you for your property. The directness of the question caught Miriam off guard. No, I don't think that. If you were interested in money, you could probably find easier ways to acquire land than taking on a widow and 2 babies. You're right about that, Ezekiel said with a slight smile. So what's your real concern? Miriam felt heat rise in her cheeks. Look at me, Mr. Brandt. Really look at me. I'm not the kind of woman men usually fight over. I'm heavy, I'm plain, and now I have 2 children who aren't yours. If you marry me, people will assume it's for the land, no matter what the truth is. That kind of talk could damage your reputation." "My reputation," Ezekiel repeated slowly. "Mrs. Hale. I live alone in a cabin in the mountains and come to town maybe once a month to buy supplies and sell pelts. Most folks already think I'm half crazy. I'm not sure my reputation can get much worse." Despite everything, Miriam found herself smiling. "You might have a point there. Besides," he continued, his expression growing serious again, "you're wrong about what kind of woman you are. I've seen plenty of beautiful women who were ugly on the inside, and I've known women who might not fit society's narrow definition of beauty, but who were worth a dozen of the so-called beauties." He looked directly at her, his gaze steady and sincere. "You defended your children against men twice your size. You've maintained your dignity and grace under circumstances that would break most people. You're worried about protecting me from gossip when you're the one who needs protection. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Miriam felt tears pricking at her eyes again. "You don't really know me, though. We've barely spoken before today." "That's true," Ezekiel acknowledged, "which is why I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, or even to accept my proposal right now. I'm asking you to consider it, to let me court you properly so we can get to know each other better." "Court me?" Miriam blinked in surprise. "But the babies, my situation, this isn't exactly a typical courtship." "Nothing about this situation is typical," Ezekiel agreed, "but that doesn't mean we can't try to do things as properly as circumstances allow. I could call on you here at the church, bring you things you need, spend time talking with you, let you get to know me better so you can make an informed decision about whether I'm the kind of man you'd want as a husband and father to your daughters." The idea was both appealing and terrifying. It had been so long since anyone had treated her as a woman worth courting rather than just a problem to be solved. "What if you decide you don't like what you learn about me?" she asked quietly. "What if you decide the same about me?" he countered. "That's the risk both of us would be taking, but it seems like a risk worth taking if it means those little girls have a chance at a real family." Before Miriam could respond, the sound of raised voices from outside the church made them both freeze. Ezekiel was on his feet in an instant, moving to the small window that looked out onto the street. "What is it?" Miriam whispered, automatically pulling her daughters closer. "Looks like the Hale brothers have been doing some drinking and talking," Ezekiel said grimly. "They're back, and they've brought friends." Through the window, Miriam could see Thomas and Samuel standing in the street, with 3 other men she recognized, ranch hands who worked for the Hale family's small cattle operation. All 5 men appeared to have been drinking, and their body language was aggressive and purposeful. "Mrs. Hale," Thomas's voice carried clearly through the church walls. "We know you're in there. Come out here and stop hiding behind that mountain man's skirts." Ezekiel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "Stay here with the babies. Don't come out no matter what you hear." "You can't face 5 men alone," Miriam protested. "I've faced worse odds than this," he said, checking his pistol before moving toward the door. "Besides, they're drunk and angry, which makes them stupid. Drunk and stupid usually beats sober and outnumbered." As he reached for the door handle, Reverend Morrison appeared in the hallway, his face pale with worry. "Mr. Brandt, please. Violence on church grounds. Surely we can resolve this peacefully." "I'm open to peaceful resolution, Reverend," Ezekiel said, "but those men outside don't sound particularly interested in peace." "Mrs. Hale," Samuel's voice joined his brother's. "You come out here right now or we're coming in to get you." Morrison wrung his hands nervously. "Perhaps if you just talked to them, explained the situation." "I tried explaining earlier," Ezekiel said. "They weren't in a listening mood then, and they're even less likely to listen now that they've been drinking." He opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, Morrison trailing behind him. Miriam could hear their footsteps echoing as they walked toward the front of the church. Left alone with her babies, Miriam felt the familiar weight of helplessness settling over her. All her life, it seemed other people had been making decisions about her fate while she stood by and watched. Her father had arranged her marriage to Jacob. The Hale brothers had tried to force her out of town. And now Ezekiel was preparing to fight for her while she hid in a back room like a child. But looking down at Sarah and Elizabeth, yes, those were their names now, she'd decided, Miriam felt something shift inside her. These weren't just her babies anymore. If Ezekiel's offer was genuine, if he really meant to become their father, then they were his daughters too. And daughters shouldn't have to watch their father face danger alone. Moving as quietly as she could, Miriam settled the babies in the nest of blankets Ezekiel had brought, making sure they were secure and warm. Then she crept to the window and peered out at the confrontation developing in the street. Ezekiel had emerged from the church and was standing on the front steps, his hands relaxed at his sides but clearly ready for trouble. The 5 men faced him from about 20 feet away, spread out in a loose semicircle that would make it difficult for him to watch them all at once. "Brandt," Thomas called out, swaying slightly on his feet. "We've come to collect what's ours. Send out my brother's widow and his children, and we'll forget about your interference earlier." "Can't do that, Thomas," Ezekiel replied, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. "Mrs. Hale is under the protection of the church right now. If you want to speak with her, you'll need to make an appointment with Reverend Morrison." "Protection of the church?" Samuel laughed harshly. "Since when does the church harbor thieves and their bastard children?" The insult hung in the air like gunpowder waiting for a spark. Miriam saw Ezekiel's shoulders tense, but his voice remained level. "Those children are Jacob's daughters, and you know it. As for Mrs. Hale, she's done nothing wrong except survive circumstances that would have broken lesser people." One of the ranch hands, a lean, dangerous-looking man named Pete Corwin, spat into the dust. "Circumstances she brought on herself. Everyone knows twin girls are bad luck. Probably cursed poor Jacob into an early grave." "That's enough," Ezekiel said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper Miriam had heard earlier. "You want to have this conversation like civilized men, or do you want to find out how uncivilized I can get?" Thomas pulled a bottle from his coat and took a long drink before answering. "Oh, we're past civilized, mountain man. You cost me face today in front of the whole town, made me look weak. That's something a man can't let stand." "You made yourself look weak, Thomas. I just gave people a clear view of what you really are." The words hit their target perfectly. Thomas's face flushed red with anger and humiliation, and he threw the bottle down hard enough to shatter it against the ground. "You think you're so much better than us," he shouted. "Living up in your mountain hideaway, looking down on the rest of us. Well, let me tell you something. We don't need your kind around here." "My kind?" Ezekiel asked quietly. "The kind that sticks his nose into other people's business. The kind that thinks he can waltz into town and steal another man's family." "I haven't stolen anything, Thomas. I offered help to people who needed it. There's a difference." Samuel stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Help that comes with conditions, I'm betting. What did you promise her? Brandt marriage protection. What do you get out of the deal?" The implication in his words was clear, and Miriam saw Ezekiel's hands slowly curl into fists. "Careful, Samuel," he said softly. "Very careful." But Samuel was either too drunk or too angry to heed the warning. Must be nice having a woman grateful enough to do whatever you want, especially one desperate enough not to be particular about. He never got to finish the sentence. Ezekiel moved with lightning speed, covering the 20 feet between them in what seemed like a single bound. His fist connected with Samuel's jaw with a sound like an axe hitting wood, and the smaller man went down hard. The other 4 men rushed forward, but Ezekiel was ready for them. He caught Pete Corwin with an elbow to the solar plexus that doubled him over, then spun to block a wild swing from one of the other ranch hands. Thomas tried to grab him from behind, but Ezekiel twisted away and landed a solid punch to his ribs that sent him staggering backward. The fourth man, seeing his companions in trouble, went for his gun. That changed everything. "Gun!" someone in the gathering crowd shouted, and suddenly the street erupted in chaos as townspeople dove for cover. Ezekiel's own pistol appeared in his hand, with practiced speed, but he was still outnumbered and in the open. Just as the ranch hand's gun cleared leather, a shot rang out from the church steps. Everyone froze as they saw Reverend Morrison standing in the doorway, holding a smoking shotgun pointed skyward. "That's enough," the preacher shouted, his usually mild voice carrying surprising authority. "I won't have gunplay on consecrated ground. The next man who draws a weapon will answer to me." The tableau held for a long moment. Ezekiel, with his gun half drawn, the ranch hand with his pistol aimed but not fired, the Hale brothers nursing their injuries and glaring with impotent rage. Finally, Thomas struggled to his feet, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "This isn't over, Brandt," he said thickly. "Not by a long shot." "It is for today," Morrison said firmly, still holding his shotgun. "I want all of you off church property right now. Thomas Samuel, you have 5 minutes to collect your men and leave before I send for the sheriff." "We are the law in this county," Thomas snarled. "My family has more influence than—" "Your family has no influence with me," Morrison interrupted, surprising everyone with his sudden backbone. "And I doubt Sheriff Henderson will appreciate being told that drunk men brawling on church grounds represents law and order." Faced with the preacher's unexpected firmness and the hostile stares of the growing crowd, Thomas finally conceded defeat. "Come on," he muttered to his men. "We'll settle this another time." As the 5 men stumbled away, nursing their wounds and their pride, the crowd began to disperse. But the conversations that started up were animated and concerned. Word of the confrontation would spread quickly through Ironwood Crossing, and Miriam knew that by evening every person in town would have heard some version of what had happened. Ezekiel holstered his gun and turned to Morrison with something approaching respect. "Thank you, Reverend. I wasn't expecting backup." Morrison set down his shotgun with shaking hands. "I may be a man of God, but I fought in the war. I know when violence is necessary and when it isn't. Those men were looking for an excuse to hurt someone, and I couldn't let that happen on church grounds." "Still," Ezekiel said, "I appreciate it. Things could have gone badly if you hadn't intervened." As the 2 men walked back into the church, Miriam hurried away from the window and back to her babies. By the time Ezekiel knocked on the vestry door, she was sitting in the chair again, trying to look as if she hadn't been watching the entire confrontation. "Are you all right?" she asked as he entered. "Fine," he said, though she could see scraped knuckles on his right hand. "How are the girls? They slept through the whole thing, thank goodness." Miriam looked up at him with concern. "This is my fault. If I hadn't—" "Stop," Ezekiel said firmly. "This is not your fault. This is about Thomas and Samuel refusing to accept that they can't control you or intimidate people into giving them what they want." He sat down on the crate again, wincing slightly as he moved. "But I won't lie to you, Mrs. Hale. This is just the beginning. They're not going to give up easily, especially now that their pride is involved." Miriam felt a chill of fear run down her spine. "What do you think they'll do?" "Hard to say. Thomas is mean and petty, but he's not stupid. He won't try another direct confrontation, especially not on church grounds. But there are other ways to make trouble." "Such as—" Ezekiel was quiet for a moment, clearly debating how much to tell her. "They could try to challenge your claim to the land in court. Claim Jacob wasn't of sound mind when he made the deed, or that there's some technicality that invalidates it. They could also try to turn the town against you by spreading rumors or creating incidents that make you look dangerous or unfit." The possibilities were overwhelming. "How can I fight something like that? I don't have money for lawyers or influence with important people." "You have something better," Ezekiel said quietly. "You have the truth, and you have people who are willing to stand up for what's right. People like you, people like me. And Reverend Morrison, apparently. Did you see him with that shotgun? I think we may have misjudged the good Reverend." Despite her fears, Miriam found herself smiling. He did seem rather different from his usual self. Sometimes it takes a crisis to show people what they're really made of, Ezekiel observed, and sometimes the people you least expect turn out to be the ones you can count on. As if summoned by their conversation, Morrison appeared in the doorway again. "Mrs. Hale, I wanted to let you know that several ladies from the congregation are organizing supplies for you and the babies. Mrs. Patterson is bringing some clothes that her youngest has outgrown, and Mrs. Wilson is preparing a proper meal." "That's very kind," Miriam said gratefully. Morrison nodded, then turned to Ezekiel. "Mr. Brandt, might I have a word with you privately?" The two men stepped out into the hallway, but their voices carried clearly through the thin walls. "I owe you an apology," Morrison said quietly. "Earlier today, when you asked about the church helping Mrs. Hale, I was less than generous in my response." "You were being practical," Ezekiel replied diplomatically. "I was being cowardly," Morrison corrected. "I was more concerned about avoiding conflict with the Hale family than I was about doing what was right. What happened out there just now, it reminded me that sometimes a man has to take a stand, even when it's uncomfortable." "Sometimes," Ezekiel agreed. "Your offer to Mrs. Hale and her children, is it genuine completely?" Morrison was quiet for a moment. "It's highly unusual. The congregation will have opinions about a widow marrying so soon after her husband's death, especially to a man she barely knows." "Mrs. Hale and I haven't made any decisions yet," Ezekiel said carefully. "We're still discussing the situation. But if you do decide to marry, you should know that you'll have my support, and the support of anyone in this congregation who has any decency left." Miriam felt a warm glow of relief at the preacher's words. Having the church's blessing would make an enormous difference in how the community viewed any arrangement she might make with Ezekiel. "Thank you, Reverend," Ezekiel said. "That means more than you know." When he returned to the vestry, Miriam could see the relief in his expression as well. "Good news?" she asked. "Better than I expected. It seems Reverend Morrison has found his backbone, and he's prepared to use it on our behalf." Our behalf. The phrase sent a little thrill through Miriam. When was the last time she'd been part of an "our" that included a strong man willing to fight for her? "Mr. Brandt," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about your offer." He sat down and gave her his full attention. "And I want to accept it. Not just the protection for my daughters, but all of it. The courtship, the possibility of marriage, the chance to build a real family together." Ezekiel's face lit up with a smile that transformed his entire appearance. "Are you sure it won't be easy? The Hale brothers aren't going to give up, and there will be gossip and judgment from some quarters." "I'm sure," Miriam said firmly. "These babies deserve a father who will love and protect them. And I deserve a chance at happiness too, don't I?" "You deserve that and more," Ezekiel said softly. "We all do." As if they understood the significance of the moment, both babies chose that instant to wake up and look around with bright, alert eyes. Sarah gurgled softly and Elizabeth waved a tiny fist in the air. Ezekiel leaned forward to get a better look at them, and his expression grew tender. "Hello there, little ones," he said gently. "I guess I'm going to be your papa." The simple words brought tears to Miriam's eyes. For the first time since Jacob's death, she could envision a future that held hope instead of fear, love instead of loneliness. Outside, the sun was beginning to set over Ironwood Crossing, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It had been a day of endings and beginnings, of confrontations and revelations. But as Miriam watched Ezekiel gently stroke her daughter's tiny hands, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The mountain man had kept his promise. He had become their protector, their champion, their hope for tomorrow, and tomorrow their real life together would begin. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful day on the church steps, and the rhythm of life in Ironwood Crossing had settled into an uneasy balance. Ezekiel had taken to visiting Miriam and the babies every afternoon, bringing supplies, helping with daily needs, and slowly building the foundation of trust that would support their unconventional courtship. The church vestry had become a temporary sanctuary, but everyone knew it couldn't remain so indefinitely. On this particular morning, Miriam was nursing Elizabeth when she heard familiar footsteps in the hallway outside. Ezekiel's knock was gentle but distinctive, 3 soft taps that had become as comforting as a lullaby over the past weeks. "Come in," she called softly. Ezekiel entered carrying a wooden crate that smelled deliciously of fresh bread and something else she couldn't identify. "Good morning," he said, setting the crate down carefully. "How did the girls sleep?" "Better," Miriam replied with a smile. "Sarah actually went 4 hours between feedings last night. I think she's finally starting to settle into a routine. And you look less tired today." It was true. The constant fear and exhaustion that had marked her first weeks of motherhood were gradually giving way to something that felt almost like normalcy. Having Ezekiel's steady presence, his practical help, and his unwavering support had made all the difference. "I brought something special today," he said, lifting the lid of the crate to reveal not just bread, but fresh eggs, milk, and what looked like a small apple pie. "Mrs. Patterson sent the pie. She said, 'New mothers need extra nourishment.'" Miriam's eyes widened. "Mrs. Patterson made me a pie, but she barely knows me." "Word's been getting around town about our situation," Ezekiel said carefully. "Some folks are curious, some are supportive, and a few—" He paused, choosing his words diplomatically. "A few have opinions they're not shy about sharing." "What kind of opinions?" Ezekiel sat down on his usual crate, his expression thoughtful. "Mixed, mostly. The women seem more accepting than the men, which probably shouldn't surprise anyone. Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Wilson, even Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house. They've all made comments about how it's right and proper for a widow with babies to have a man's protection. And the men, some think I'm a fool for taking on another man's responsibilities. Others think you're a schemer who's trapped a lonely bachelor with false promises." His voice hardened slightly. "Those opinions matter less to me than what the mice in the church rafters think." Despite the seriousness of the topic, Miriam found herself smiling. "You have a way of putting things in perspective, Mr. Brandt." "Ezekiel," he corrected gently. "I think we're past formal titles, don't you?" The use of his first name felt intimate, almost daring. "Ezekiel, then, and you should call me Miriam." "Miriam." He said her name like he was tasting it, and she felt a little flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the babies or their situation and everything to do with the way this remarkable man looked at her. A sharp knock on the outer church door interrupted the moment. They both tensed, listening as Reverend Morrison's footsteps echoed through the hallway, followed by the sound of voices, one of which was unmistakably Thomas Hale's. "Mrs. Hale," Thomas's voice carried clearly through the building. "I need to speak with you. It's important." Ezekiel was already on his feet, his hand instinctively moving to his gun. "Stay here with the babies." "Ezekiel, wait." Miriam struggled to stand while still holding Elizabeth. "Maybe we should hear what he has to say. It's been 3 weeks since the confrontation. Perhaps he's ready to be reasonable." "Men like Thomas Hale don't become reasonable," Ezekiel said grimly. "They just get more creative about being unreasonable." But Miriam was already moving toward the door. "If I'm going to be part of this community, I can't hide in the church forever. Besides, Reverend Morrison is with him. Surely Thomas won't try anything violent with a man of God present." Ezekiel looked like he wanted to argue, but he could see the determination in her face. "All right, but I stay with you, and at the first sign of trouble, we leave." They found Thomas Hale standing in the church's main sanctuary, hat in hand, looking almost contrite. Reverend Morrison stood nearby, his expression carefully neutral but watchful. Samuel was notably absent, as were the ranch hands who had supported the brothers during their last confrontation. "Miriam," Thomas said as they approached, his voice surprisingly gentle, Thank you for seeing me. I know things have been difficult between us lately." "That's one way to put it," Ezekiel said dryly, positioning himself slightly in front of Miriam and the babies. Thomas's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "I'm not here to fight Brandt. I'm here to talk business." "What kind of business?" Miriam asked warily. Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. "I've been thinking about our situation, and I believe I have a solution that could benefit everyone involved." He held out the paper, but Ezekiel intercepted it before Miriam could take it. "What is this?" "A purchase offer," Thomas said, "for Jacob's land. A fair price. More than fair, actually. Enough money for Miriam to start fresh, somewhere else, maybe back east, where she has family." Miriam felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "I don't have family back east, Thomas. You know that." "Well, somewhere else then. The point is this money would give you options. Freedom. You wouldn't have to depend on—" He glanced at Ezekiel with barely concealed distaste. "You wouldn't have to depend on charity from strangers." Ezekiel unfolded the document and read it quickly, his expression growing more skeptical with each line. "This is interesting, Thomas. Very detailed. Almost like you had a lawyer draw it up." "I did have a lawyer draw it up," Thomas admitted. "I wanted everything to be legal and proper. And this lawyer would be Mr. Whitmore from Tucson. He specializes in property transactions." Ezekiel's eyes narrowed. "Edgar Whitmore, the same Edgar Whitmore who handles all the territorial land deals for the railroad companies." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know about his other clients. I just know he's qualified to handle this kind of transaction." "How much?" Miriam asked quietly. $800. Thomas said, as if this were an enormously generous sum. The number hung in the air like smoke. Miriam knew very little about land values, but even she could tell that $800 seemed low for 40 acres with water rights. 800, Ezekiel repeated slowly, for 40 acres of prime land with the only reliable water source in the county. "It's fair compensation," Thomas said defensively. "More than fair considering the circumstances." "What circumstances would those be?" "Well, the isolation for one thing. It's hard to farm effectively. And there's been talk lately about Apache trouble in the area. Property values have been dropping because of the increased risk." Ezekiel's laugh was cold and humorless. "Apache trouble, Thomas. The nearest Apache settlement is 200 miles south of here, and they haven't raided this far north in over 3 years. As for isolation, that land is less than 5 miles from town on a well-established road." "Maybe you know something I don't," Thomas said, his facade of reasonableness beginning to slip. "But the fact remains this is a generous offer for property that's going to be difficult for a widow to manage on her own." "She won't be managing it on her own," Ezekiel said quietly. Yes, your arrangement." Thomas's voice dripped with disapproval. "About that, Miriam, you should know that people are talking. The kind of talk that could make life very difficult for you and those babies." Miriam felt her cheeks burn. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that happens when a woman moves in with a man she barely knows just weeks after her husband's death. People are saying you were probably carrying on with Brandt while Jacob was still alive. They're saying those babies might not even be Jacob's children." The accusation hit Miriam like a physical blow. She gasped, clutching Elizabeth tighter against her chest. "That's not true. How dare you suggest—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Thomas said with false sincerity. "I'm just telling you what other people are saying, and once that kind of talk starts, it's very hard to stop." Ezekiel's voice was deadly quiet when he spoke. "And I suppose you've done nothing to encourage this talk?" Thomas shrugged. "I can't control what people choose to believe, especially when they see a woman making questionable decisions about her reputation." "The only questionable decision I see," Reverend Morrison interjected suddenly, "is a man spreading lies about his dead brother's wife." Everyone turned to stare at the preacher, who had been so quiet they'd almost forgotten he was there. "Reverend Morrison," Thomas said with surprise, I wasn't aware you had opinions about this matter." "I have many opinions about many things," Morrison replied calmly. "For instance, I have opinions about men who would use gossip and intimidation to cheat a widow out of her rightful inheritance." Thomas's mask of reasonableness finally slipped completely. Her rightful inheritance, that land, should have gone to blood family, not some outsider who happened to warm Jacob's bed for a few years. The crude words echoed through the church sanctuary like blasphemy. Miriam made a small sound of distress, and Ezekiel took a step forward, his fists clenched. "I think," Morrison said with icy authority, "that you should leave. Now." "This isn't over," Thomas said, snatching the purchase offer back from Ezekiel. "That land belongs in the Hale family, and I'll do whatever it takes to see that justice is done." "Justice?" Ezekiel's voice was soft but dangerous. "Is that what you're calling it?" Thomas backed toward the door, suddenly remembering the last time he'd faced Ezekiel's anger. "The law will support my claim. Blood relations have rights that supersede the whims of a dying man." "Jacob wasn't dying when he made that deed," Miriam said, finding her voice at last. "He was healthy and in full possession of his faculties. Was he a man in his 20s dying suddenly of heart failure? That's unusual, some might say suspicious." The implication was clear, and it sucked all the air out of the room. Thomas was suggesting that Jacob's death hadn't been natural, that Miriam might have had something to do with it. Ezekiel moved so fast that Thomas barely had time to register the threat before he found himself pinned against the church door, Ezekiel's forearm pressed against his throat. "Say that again," Ezekiel whispered. "Please, give me an excuse." "Ezekiel, don't." Miriam's voice was shaky but firm. "He's not worth it. And this is exactly what he wants, to provoke you into doing something that will make us look guilty." For a moment, the only sound in the church was Thomas's labored breathing as he struggled against Ezekiel's grip. Then slowly, the mountain man stepped back. "Get out," he said simply, "before I forget that we're standing in God's house." Thomas stumbled through the door and disappeared into the street, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with unspoken threats. "My God," Morrison said quietly, "he actually suggested that Jacob was murdered," Miriam finished numbly. "He's going to spread rumors that I poisoned my own husband for his land." Ezekiel was pacing now, his anger barely contained. "He's more desperate than I thought, and more dangerous. If he's willing to accuse you of murder, people might believe it," Miriam said, sinking down onto a pew with both babies still in her arms. "A fat widow who inherits valuable land and then immediately takes up with another man. It's exactly the kind of story people love to believe." "Not everyone," Morrison said firmly. "I knew Jacob well. I saw him regularly in the weeks before his death, and he was excited about becoming a father. He talked constantly about his plans for the farm, about teaching his children to read and write. He was not a man who was being slowly poisoned." "But you didn't examine his body," Miriam said quietly. "Dr. Hensley did, and he's been known to take money for keeping quiet about inconvenient findings." Ezekiel stopped pacing and stared at her. "Are you saying Hensley might support Thomas's accusations?" "I'm saying that for the right price, Dr. Hensley might be willing to remember symptoms he overlooked at the time, symptoms that could suggest poisoning instead of natural heart failure." The implications were staggering. If Thomas could produce medical testimony suggesting that Jacob had been murdered, he could potentially have Miriam arrested and charged. Even if the charges didn't stick, the scandal would be enough to destroy any chance she had of maintaining her claim to the land. "We need to get ahead of this," Ezekiel said grimly. "If Thomas is planning to make formal accusations, we need to be prepared with evidence of our own." "What kind of evidence?" "Character witnesses for one thing. People who knew you and Jacob who can testify to the state of your marriage and your husband's health. We also need to document the timeline of events. When Jacob died, when the babies were born, when I first offered to help you. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. I can provide testimony about Jacob's state of mind in the weeks before his death, and there are others in the congregation who can speak to your character, Miriam. Will it be enough? Miriam asked. It has to be, Ezekiel said, because if Thomas succeeds in casting doubt on the legitimacy of your inheritance, he won't stop there. He'll find ways to challenge my right to adopt the girls, to question the validity of any marriage between us. The sound of running footsteps outside the church interrupted their planning. A moment later, young Billy Henderson burst through the doors, his face flushed with excitement and fear. Reverend Morrison, he gasped, you need to come quick. Sheriff's riding in from Tucson, and he's got papers with him. Morrison and Ezekiel exchanged grim looks. What kind of papers, Billy? Legal papers, I think. Mr. Thomas Hale met him at the edge of town, and they've been talking for the past 10 minutes. Now they're heading this way. Miriam felt her blood turn to ice. He's having me arrested. We don't know that, Ezekiel said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maybe it's something else. What else could it be? He threatened to use the law against me, and now the sheriff is here with legal papers. It doesn't take a scholar to connect those dots. Morrison was already moving toward the door. Billy, run to Mrs. Patterson's house and tell her what's happening. Ask her to gather some of the other ladies and come to the church. If they're planning to arrest Miriam, they'll need witnesses to make sure everything is done properly. As Billy ran off, Morrison turned back to Miriam and Ezekiel. Whatever happens next, remember that you're not alone in this. The church stands behind you, and so do all the decent people in this community. The sound of horses approaching grew louder, and through the windows they could see Sheriff Henderson dismounting in front of the church. Thomas Hale was with him along with 2 other men Miriam didn't recognize, probably deputies from Tucson. Miriam, Ezekiel said urgently, listen to me. No matter what they say, no matter what they accuse you of, don't admit to anything. Don't try to explain or defend yourself. Just stay calm and let them say their piece. What about the babies? I'll take care of them. Whatever happens, I'll make sure Sarah and Elizabeth are safe. The promise should have been comforting, but all Miriam could think about was how quickly her fragile new happiness was about to be destroyed. 3 weeks ago, she'd been facing the prospect of being cast out into the wilderness with 2 newborn babies. Now she was about to be accused of murdering her husband. Sheriff Henderson knocked on the church door with the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. Morrison took a deep breath and went to answer it. Sheriff Henderson, the preacher said formally, what brings you to Ironwood Crossing? Official business, Reverend. I need to speak with Mrs. Miriam Hale. She's here, Morrison replied, along with her children and Mr. Brandt. Henderson stepped into the church, followed by Thomas and the 2 deputies. The sheriff was a tall, weathered man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of steady demeanor that came from years of dealing with difficult situations. Mrs. Hale, he said, touching his hat respectfully, I'm Sheriff Henderson. I believe you know my wife. She runs the boarding house here in town. Yes, Miriam managed. She's been very kind. I'm here because I've received some serious allegations regarding your late husband's death. Allegations that require investigation. What kind of allegations? Ezekiel asked, though they all knew the answer. Henderson pulled a folded document from his coat. Allegations that Jacob Hale did not die of natural causes, and that his death may have been the result of deliberate poisoning. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Miriam felt the world spinning around her, and only Ezekiel's steadying hand on her shoulder kept her from collapsing. These are serious charges, Morrison said carefully. What evidence supports such allegations? That's what we're here to determine, Henderson replied. Mr. Thomas Hale has presented testimony suggesting that his brother exhibited symptoms consistent with certain types of poisoning in the weeks before his death. We need to investigate these claims thoroughly. What kind of investigation? Ezekiel asked. For starters, we'll need to exhume Jacob Hale's body for examination by a qualified physician. We'll also need to interview anyone who had contact with the deceased in the days before his death. Thomas stepped forward, his face a mask of false concern. I want you to know, Miriam, that this brings me no pleasure, but justice must be served, especially for my poor brother's sake. Justice, Miriam repeated numbly. Is that what this is? It's what it has to be, Thomas said. Surely you understand that. Sheriff Henderson consulted his papers again. Mrs. Hale, I have a warrant here authorizing the exhumation of your husband's remains. The examination will be conducted by Dr. Franklin Morris from the Territorial Medical Examiner's Office. When? Miriam asked quietly. Tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I'm afraid I need to ask you not to leave town. This is not an arrest, not yet, but you are considered a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. She's not going anywhere, Ezekiel said firmly. She has newborn babies to care for and nowhere else to go, even if she wanted to leave. Henderson nodded. I understand this is difficult, Mrs. Hale, but I'm sure you want the truth to come out as much as anyone. The truth, Miriam said, looking directly at Thomas, is that my husband died of heart failure just as Dr. Hensley determined at the time. The truth is that some people will stop at nothing to steal what doesn't belong to them. Thomas's face flushed with anger. How dare you accuse me of— I'm not accusing you of anything, Miriam interrupted, her voice growing stronger. I'm stating facts. You want my land and you're willing to destroy my reputation and endanger my children to get it. That's enough, Henderson said firmly. There'll be time for accusations and defenses later. Right now, we need to let the investigation proceed according to the law. As the sheriff and his deputies prepared to leave, Thomas lingered for a moment. I hope you understand, Miriam, that this is bigger than personal feelings. This is about justice for Jacob and about making sure his children are raised by people who are appropriate. The threat was clear. Even if Miriam avoided criminal charges, Thomas intended to use the scandal to challenge her fitness as a mother and Ezekiel's suitability as an adoptive father. After the law enforcement officers left, the church fell silent except for the soft sounds of the baby's breathing. Miriam sat staring at the door through which her accusers had departed, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. They're going to dig up Jacob, she said quietly. They're going to cut him open and examine his body for signs of poison that don't exist. And when they don't find any evidence of poisoning, Ezekiel said, this whole nightmare will be over. Will it? Even if the examination clears me of murder, the gossip will never stop. People will always wonder, always whisper, and Thomas will find new ways to attack us. Morrison sat down beside her on the pew. Have faith, Miriam. The truth has a way of prevailing even when it seems like darkness is winning. Does it? Because right now it feels like Thomas holds all the advantages. He has money, influence, legal connections. What do we have? We have each other, Ezekiel said simply. We have the truth, and we have people who believe in us. As if summoned by his words, the church door opened again, and Mrs. Patterson entered, followed by Mrs. Wilson and 3 other women from the congregation. Their faces were set with determination, and they carried baskets and bundles that suggested they'd come prepared for a long vigil. We heard, Mrs. Patterson said without preamble. The whole town's buzzing with talk about sheriff's warrants and murder accusations. We came to show our support. Mrs. Wilson stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Miriam's shoulder. No one who knew you and Jacob believes these terrible lies, dear. We're here to make sure you know that. The simple gesture of solidarity broke something loose inside Miriam, and tears began flowing down her cheeks. For weeks, she'd felt isolated and vulnerable, dependent on Ezekiel's protection and the church's charity, but now she realized that she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. Thank you, she whispered. You have no idea what this means. We have every idea, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. We've all seen what can happen when good people stay silent in the face of injustice. Not this time. As the women settled in for what promised to be a long evening of waiting and worrying, Ezekiel pulled Morrison aside. "Reverend, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. Is there any chance at all that Thomas might be right about Jacob's death?" Morrison looked shocked. "You think Miriam might have—" "No," Ezekiel said quickly. "I don't think that for a second, but I need to know if there's anything in Jacob's final days that could be twisted to support Thomas's accusations, anything that might look suspicious to people who want to believe the worst." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking back to his last conversations with Jacob Hale. "Jacob was worried about something in the weeks before he died," he said finally. "He asked me several times about legal matters, wills, property transfers, that sort of thing." "What kind of legal matters?" "He wanted to make sure that if anything happened to him, Miriam and the babies would be protected. He was particularly concerned about his brother's intentions regarding the land." Ezekiel felt a chill run down his spine. He was planning to change his will. He had changed it. "He came to me just a week before he died, asking me to witness a new will that left everything to Miriam, absolutely with no provisions for his brothers to inherit if she remarried or died." "Does Thomas know about this new will?" "I don't know. Jacob said he was planning to tell his brothers about the changes, but I don't know if he ever had the chance." The implications were staggering. If Thomas knew that Jacob had specifically written him out of the inheritance, it would provide a powerful motive for murder, not by Miriam, but by Thomas himself. "Reverend," Ezekiel said urgently, "where is this new will?" "Jacob said he was keeping it in his personal papers at home, but after he died—" Morrison trailed off, his face pale with realization. "After he died, Thomas and Samuel were the ones who went through his belongings," Ezekiel finished. "They could have destroyed it and claimed the old will was still valid." "My God," Morrison whispered. "If that's true, then Thomas isn't just trying to steal Miriam's inheritance. He's covering up evidence of his own motive for murder." The two men looked at each other in horrified understanding. They had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than a simple property dispute. If their suspicions were correct, then Thomas Hale wasn't just a greedy brother-in-law. He was potentially a murderer who was now desperate enough to frame an innocent woman to protect himself. And tomorrow, when Jacob's body was exhumed and examined, they would learn whether their worst fears were justified. The revelation about Jacob's missing will hung heavy in the air between Ezekiel and Morrison, but there was no time to fully process its implications. Outside, the sound of approaching wagons announced the arrival of Dr. Franklin Morris and his team from Tucson. Dawn was still hours away, but the territorial medical examiner had apparently decided to begin his grim work under cover of darkness. Ezekiel moved to the window and peered out at the convoy stopping near the cemetery behind the church. "They're not wasting any time," he said grimly. Morrison joined him at the window. "Dr. Morris is very thorough and very expensive. I can't help but wonder how Thomas managed to secure his services so quickly." "Money talks," Ezekiel replied. "The question is where Thomas got enough of it to hire the territory's most prominent medical examiner on such short notice." In the main sanctuary, Miriam sat surrounded by the women of the congregation, her babies sleeping peacefully in her arms, despite the chaos swirling around them. She looked up as Ezekiel and Morrison returned from their whispered conference. "What's happening out there?" she asked quietly. "Dr. Morris has arrived," Morrison said gently. "He'll be conducting the examination shortly." Mrs. Patterson stood up abruptly, her face flushed with indignation. "This is barbaric, disturbing a man's eternal rest based on nothing but spite and greed." "It's necessary," said a new voice from the doorway. Thomas Hale entered the church uninvited, his boots echoing loudly in the sacred space. "Justice demands a thorough investigation." Justice, Mrs. Wilson said with disgust. Is that what you're calling this charade? Thomas ignored her and addressed Miriam directly. I thought you should know that Dr. Morris will be looking for traces of several specific poisons, arsenic, strychnine, and a few others that are readily available to someone with access to household supplies. The specific mention of poisons sent a chill through the room. Miriam felt her stomach lurch as she realized the implications. You've already told him what to look for. I've provided him with a list of symptoms that Jacob exhibited in his final weeks, symptoms that I now realize were consistent with certain types of poisoning. Ezekiel stepped between Thomas and Miriam, his voice deadly quiet. Symptoms you conveniently remembered only after you decided you wanted Jacob's land. Symptoms I didn't understand at the time, Thomas countered. Jacob complained of stomach pains, headaches, fatigue. I thought it was just the stress of impending fatherhood. Now I know better. Those are symptoms of overwork and worry, Morrison interjected. Jacob was working extra hours as deputy, preparing for the babies, managing the farm. Any man in his position would have been tired. Would any man in his position have died suddenly of heart failure at 26? Thomas asked pointedly. Dr. Hensley said Jacob's heart was weak, but Jacob never showed any signs of heart problems before. Doesn't that strike anyone as suspicious? The question hung in the air, and Miriam could see doubt beginning to creep into some faces. Thomas was clever enough to raise questions that sounded reasonable on the surface, even though his motivations were transparently selfish. Many things can weaken a man's heart, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. Illness, stress, grief over lost parents. Jacob lost both his mother and father within 2 years of each other, and conveniently inherited the family land as a result, Thomas said. Land that he then deeded to his wife just months before his death. Because he loved her, Morrison said with exasperation. Because he wanted to ensure that his family would be provided for. There's nothing suspicious about a man taking care of his wife and children. Thomas smiled coldly. We'll see what Dr. Morris finds. If Jacob died of natural causes, the examination will prove it. If he didn't, he let the threat hang unfinished. A commotion outside interrupted the tense conversation. Through the windows, they could see lanterns moving in the cemetery as Dr. Morris's team began their work. The sight of men with shovels approaching Jacob's grave made Miriam feel physically ill. I can't watch this, she whispered, turning away from the window. I can't bear to see them disturb his rest. Then don't watch, Ezekiel said, gently guiding her to a pew that faced away from the cemetery. There's nothing you can do to stop it, and torturing yourself won't help anyone. Thomas had moved to the window to observe the exhumation. Dr. Morris estimates it will take about 3 hours to complete the examination, he announced. We should have our answers by sunrise. And if the examination shows that Jacob died of natural causes, Ezekiel asked, then I'll accept the results and withdraw my accusations, Thomas said. I'm not unreasonable, I just want the truth. No, said a new voice from the back of the church. You want the land. Everyone turned to see Samuel Hale entering, but his appearance was shocking. The younger brother looked haggard and disheveled, his clothes wrinkled and stained with what looked like whiskey. His hands were shaking, and his eyes held the wild look of a man on the edge of breaking. Samuel, Thomas said sharply, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be watching the ranch. Watching the ranch, Samuel laughed bitterly. Watching the ranch while you destroy what's left of our family's honor. Is that what Jacob would have wanted, Thomas? His wife accused of murder, his children branded as bastards. Thomas's face darkened with anger. Jacob is dead, Samuel, and if someone killed him, they need to pay for it. If someone killed him, Samuel's voice rose to near hysteria. You know damn well who killed Jacob, Thomas. You know, and you're letting her take the blame. The sanctuary fell dead silent. Samuel's words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, and everyone present understood their terrible implication. Samuel, Thomas said in a warning tone, you're drunk. You don't know what you're saying. Don't I? Samuel swayed on his feet, but his voice was becoming clearer, more focused. I know plenty, Thomas. I know about the meeting you had with Whitmore 3 weeks before Jacob died. I know about the plans to build a railroad spur through our county, and I know why you needed Jacob's land so badly. Miriam looked up sharply. What meeting? What railroad? Samuel turned to her with eyes full of guilt and pain. The Denver and Rio Grande is planning to extend their line through Arizona territory. The proposed route runs right through Jacob's property, through that spring. Whoever controls the water rights stands to make thousands of dollars selling water to the railroad company. That's enough, Samuel, Thomas said, moving toward his brother with clear intent to silence him, but Samuel backed away, pulling a pistol from his coat. No, Thomas, I'm done keeping your secrets. I'm done pretending that what we did was right. What you did? Ezekiel's voice was sharp with interest. What exactly did you do, Samuel? Samuel's hand holding the gun was shaking violently, but his finger was on the trigger. We knew about the railroad contract before anyone else did. Whitmore told us he was trying to arrange quiet purchases of land along the proposed route, but Jacob wouldn't sell, said the land was for his children, for their future. So you killed him for it, Morrison said, his voice filled with horror and disgust. I didn't want to. Samuel's voice broke. It was Thomas's idea. He said it would be quick, painless, just a little something in Jacob's coffee to make his heart stop. Said it would look natural, that no one would ever know. Thomas lunged for his brother, but Samuel swung the gun toward him. Stay back. I'm done protecting you. You're protecting yourself too, Thomas snarled. You think anyone will believe you weren't a willing participant? You helped mix the poison. You helped put it in his food. Because you threatened me. You said if I didn't help, you'd frame me for stealing from the ranch accounts. You said I'd hang either way. The confession was devastating in its completeness. Miriam felt the world spinning around her as the truth of her husband's murder was laid bare. Jacob hadn't died of a weak heart or natural causes. He'd been deliberately poisoned by his own brothers for the sake of money and land. My God, she whispered, you murdered him. You murdered your own brother. It wasn't supposed to be murder, Thomas said desperately, his facade of righteousness finally crumbling. It was supposed to be a clean death, no suffering. Jacob would have died eventually anyway. His heart was weak. His heart was fine. Dr. Morris's voice boomed from the church doorway. The medical examiner had apparently finished his work and arrived in time to hear the confessions. I've completed my preliminary examination, and there's no evidence of heart disease, but there is clear evidence of arsenic poisoning. Sheriff Henderson appeared behind the doctor along with his deputies. Dr. Morris sent word as soon as he found the poison. We came as quickly as we could. Thomas looked around wildly, realizing that his carefully constructed plan had collapsed completely. You can't prove anything. It's the word of a drunk against mine. Actually, Dr. Morris said, consulting his notes, I can prove quite a lot. The concentration of arsenic in the victim's tissues indicates poisoning over a period of several weeks. The pattern of accumulation suggests the poison was administered in small, regular doses, probably in food or drink. And I have witnesses to your confession, Sheriff Henderson added, including a church full of respectable citizens. Samuel was sobbing now, the gun forgotten in his trembling hand. I'm sorry, Miriam. I'm so sorry. I never wanted Jacob to die. I loved him too. You loved him so much you helped poison him, Ezekiel said coldly, moving carefully toward Samuel. You loved him so much you were willing to let his wife hang for your crime. I couldn't stop it, Samuel wailed. Thomas said it was too late to back out. Said if Jacob lived, he'd eventually figure out what we were planning and have us both arrested for conspiracy. Sheriff Henderson was already moving to arrest Thomas, but the older Hale brother wasn't finished fighting. You can't arrest me based on the ravings of a drunk. Samuel's been unstable for months. Everyone knows it. Thomas Hale, Henderson said formally. You're under arrest for the murder of Jacob Hale and for conspiracy to commit fraud. You have the right to—" Thomas suddenly broke away from the sheriff and lunged toward Miriam and the babies. "If I can't have that land, nobody can." But Ezekiel was faster. He intercepted Thomas with a devastating right cross that sent the man sprawling across the church floor. Thomas tried to get up, but Ezekiel planted a boot firmly on his chest. "Stay down," he said quietly. "Please give me an excuse to hurt you more." As the deputies moved in to restrain Thomas, Samuel dropped his gun and collapsed to his knees. "I want to confess," he said through his tears. "I want to tell you everything. Maybe if I help convict Thomas, Jacob's spirit can finally rest." Sheriff Henderson looked grimly satisfied as he applied handcuffs to Thomas. "Samuel Hale, you're also under arrest for murder and conspiracy. Dr. Morris, I'll need your full report for the territorial prosecutor." "You'll have it by tomorrow," Morris assured him. "This is one of the clearest cases of arsenic poisoning I've ever examined. Whoever administered it knew exactly what they were doing." As the Hale brothers were led away in chains, the church fell silent, except for the soft sounds of the babies stirring in their mother's arms. Miriam sat staring at the doors, through which her husband's murderers had just been taken, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. "It's over," Ezekiel said softly, sitting down beside her. "The truth is out. You're free." "Am I?" Miriam's voice was hollow with shock. "Jacob is still dead. My daughters will still grow up without their real father, and everyone in town will remember that their mother was accused of murder even if the charges were false." "They'll remember that their mother was innocent," Morrison corrected gently. "They'll remember that evil men tried to destroy your family and failed. They'll remember that justice prevailed." Mrs. Patterson came forward and knelt beside Miriam's pew. "Dear, you've been through more than anyone should have to bear, but you've survived it all with grace and dignity. Your daughters will be proud of the mother they have, and they'll be proud of the father they're about to have," Mrs. Wilson added, looking meaningfully at Ezekiel. For the first time since the nightmare began, Miriam felt a glimmer of hope stirring in her chest. "You still want to marry me?" she asked Ezekiel quietly. "After all this scandal and horror, I want to marry you more than ever," he replied firmly. "You've proven that you're exactly the kind of woman I want as my wife and the mother of my children. Strong, loyal, brave in the face of terrible adversity. But the gossip, the questions about my reputation, will die down once people realize that you were the victim, not the villain. And anyone who continues to spread lies about you will answer to me." Dr. Morris approached them with his medical bag in hand. "Mrs. Hale, I want you to know that my examination completely exonerates you of any wrongdoing. The pattern of poisoning clearly indicates that someone with regular access to Jacob's food was administering small doses over time. Given that you were heavily pregnant and then recovering from childbirth during the relevant period, it would have been impossible for you to carry out such a systematic poisoning." "Thank you, doctor," Miriam said gratefully. "Your expertise probably saved my life." "Justice saved your life," Morris corrected. "I just provided the evidence. Those brothers would have let you hang for their crime without a second thought." Sheriff Henderson returned to the church after securing his prisoners in the town jail. "Mrs. Hale, I owe you an apology. I should have investigated Thomas's claims more thoroughly before treating you as a suspect." "You were doing your job," Miriam replied. "I don't fault you for following the law. Still, I could have handled things differently. For what it's worth, I never really believed you were capable of murder. A woman who fights as hard as you have to protect her children isn't the kind who kills for money." As the various officials prepared to leave, Reverend Morrison stood up and addressed the small group that remained. "If I may," he said formally, "I'd like to take this opportunity to make an announcement. Mrs. Hale and Mr. Brandt have asked me to perform their wedding ceremony as soon as legally possible. Given the circumstances and the need to provide these children with legal protection and security, I plan to post the banns immediately and perform the ceremony within the week." A murmur of approval went up from the ladies of the congregation. Mrs. Patterson clapped her hands together with delight. "How wonderful! We'll need to organize a proper celebration." "Nothing elaborate," Miriam said quickly. "Just something simple and dignified." "Nonsense," Mrs. Wilson declared. "You've been through enough hardship. It's time for some joy and celebration in your life." As the group began making enthusiastic plans for the wedding, Ezekiel drew Miriam aside for a private moment. "Are you sure about this?" he asked gently. "I know it's been an overwhelming day. If you need more time to think." "I don't need more time," Miriam said firmly. "I've already lost too much time to fear and uncertainty. I want to marry you, Ezekiel. I want to build a life with you and give my daughters the father they deserve. And I want to give you the husband you deserve," he replied, taking her hands in his. "I promise you'll never have to face anything alone again." Looking down at the babies in her arms, Miriam felt a sense of peace settling over her for the first time in months. Sarah and Elizabeth would grow up knowing they were wanted, protected, and loved. They would have a father who chose them, who fought for them, who would teach them to be strong and brave. "What will we tell them when they're older?" she asked quietly. "About their birth father, about what really happened. We'll tell them the truth," Ezekiel said without hesitation. "That Jacob was a good man who loved them and their mother. That evil men took him away too soon, but that justice was served. And that sometimes families are built not just by blood, but by choice and love." Outside, the sun was beginning to rise over Ironwood Crossing, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. It was going to be a beautiful day, the first day of their new life together. "Mrs. Patterson," Miriam called out to the enthusiastic wedding planner, "I have one request for the ceremony." "Anything, dear. What is it?" "I want to carry both babies down the aisle. I want everyone to see that we're becoming a family, all four of us together." Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears. "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." As the women continued their wedding preparations and the men discussed the legal ramifications of the night's revelations, Miriam found herself thinking about Jacob. She hoped his spirit could finally rest, knowing that his murderers had been brought to justice and his family was safe. The nightmare was over. The truth had prevailed. And tomorrow, or perhaps next week when Reverend Morrison performed the ceremony, she would become Mrs. Ezekiel Brandt, with two beautiful daughters and a future full of hope. The mountain man had kept his promise. He had become their protector, their champion, their salvation. And soon he would become their family. 5 days later, the morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of the church, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews that had been decorated with wildflowers and ribbons by the ladies of the congregation. The same sanctuary that had witnessed accusations of murder and confessions of guilt was now transformed into a place of joy and new beginnings. Miriam stood in the small vestry room looking at herself in the mirror that Mrs. Patterson had brought from her own home. The dress she wore had belonged to Mrs. Wilson's daughter, a simple but elegant gown of ivory silk that had been carefully altered to fit Miriam's fuller figure. It was beautiful in its simplicity, with pearl buttons down the back and delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. "You look radiant," Mrs. Patterson said, adjusting the small spray of orange blossoms in Miriam's hair. "Absolutely radiant." Miriam hardly recognized herself. The exhausted, frightened woman who had been dragged through the streets by her tormentors seemed like a stranger now. In her place stood someone who looked confident, hopeful, ready to embrace whatever the future might bring. "I can't believe this is really happening," she said softly, smoothing her hands over the silk skirt. "A week ago I thought my life was over. Now you're about to marry the finest man in the territory," Mrs. Wilson declared, settling the twins in their shared basket. Sarah and Elizabeth wore matching gowns of white cotton, embroidered with tiny roses by the skilled hands of the church ladies. They looked like angels, their dark hair curling softly around their peaceful faces. "Are you nervous?" Mrs. Patterson asked gently. Miriam considered the question seriously. "No," she said with some surprise. "I thought I would be, but I'm not. I feel ready, like this is exactly where I'm supposed to be." A soft knock on the door interrupted their conversation. "Ladies, it's time," came Reverend Morrison's voice from the hallway. Mrs. Patterson handed Miriam the basket containing her daughters. "Remember, we'll be sitting in the front row if you need anything, but you won't need anything except what's in your heart." Miriam lifted the basket carefully, marveling at how light it felt despite carrying 2 babies. "Thank you," she said to the women who had become her champions and friends, "for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." "You'll repay it by being happy," Mrs. Wilson said firmly. "By building a good life with that mountain man of yours and raising those babies to be strong, decent people." The church was fuller than Miriam had expected when she stepped into the sanctuary. It seemed that most of Ironwood Crossing had turned out for the wedding, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, approval, and genuine happiness. Even some folks from neighboring ranches had made the journey to witness this unusual union. At the front of the church, Ezekiel waited beside Reverend Morrison. He wore his best suit, dark wool that emphasized his broad shoulders and made his pale blue eyes seem even more striking. His hair had been carefully combed, and he'd trimmed his beard for the occasion. But it was the expression on his face that took Miriam's breath away. He was looking at her as if she were the most beautiful woman in the world, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. As she walked down the aisle carrying her daughters, Miriam was aware of the whispered comments from the congregation, but unlike the cruel gossip that had plagued her weeks earlier, these whispers were warm and approving. "Look how beautiful she is. Those babies are precious. He's a lucky man. She's lucky too. Ezekiel Brandt is solid as granite." Halfway down the aisle, Miriam caught sight of Sheriff Henderson sitting with his wife. He nodded respectfully to her, and she saw approval in his weathered face. The man who had once brought papers accusing her of murder was now witnessing her triumph over those who had tried to destroy her. When she reached the altar, Ezekiel stepped forward to meet her. "You're beautiful," he said quietly, his voice full of wonder. "So are you," she replied, meaning every word. Reverend Morrison cleared his throat and addressed the congregation. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Ezekiel Brandt and Miriam Hale in holy matrimony. This ceremony represents not just the joining of 2 hearts, but the creation of a family built on love, commitment, and the courage to choose hope over fear." The traditional words took on special meaning given everything they had endured to reach this moment. When Morrison asked if anyone had cause why the couple should not be wed, the silence was profound and affirming. "Ezekiel," Morrison continued, "do you take Miriam to be your lawfully wedded wife to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Ezekiel said, his voice strong and clear. "And I also promise to love and protect Sarah and Elizabeth as if they were my own daughters, to guide them with wisdom and kindness, and to ensure they always know they are wanted and cherished." The unexpected addition to the traditional vows brought tears to many eyes in the congregation. This was more than a marriage. It was a formal adoption ceremony as well. "Miriam," Morrison said, his own voice touched with emotion, "do you take Ezekiel to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Miriam replied, looking directly into Ezekiel's eyes, "and I promise to trust you with my heart and my children's future, to stand beside you through whatever challenges we may face, and to build with you a home filled with love and laughter." As they exchanged rings, simple gold bands that Ezekiel had purchased from the jeweler in Tucson, both babies began to stir in their basket. Sarah opened her eyes and looked around with what seemed like curiosity, while Elizabeth made soft cooing sounds that echoed in the quiet church. "It appears," Morrison said with a smile, "that Sarah and Elizabeth approve of these proceedings." The congregation chuckled softly, and the moment of gentle humor seemed to bless the ceremony with joy and lightness. "By the power vested in me, by the territory of Arizona, and by God Almighty," Morrison declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife, and this family complete and whole. Ezekiel, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle but firm, full of promise and commitment. When they parted, both were smiling through tears of happiness. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison announced to the congregation, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Ezekiel Brandt and their daughters, Sarah and Elizabeth." The church erupted in applause and cheers. Mrs. Patterson was crying openly, and even the usually stoic Sheriff Henderson was wiping his eyes. As the couple turned to face their friends and neighbors, Miriam felt an overwhelming sense of belonging and acceptance. Following the ceremony, the entire congregation moved to the area behind the church where the ladies had organized a wedding feast. Tables groaned under the weight of fresh bread, roasted chicken, vegetables from various gardens, and pies of every description. Someone had even managed to procure a small wedding cake decorated with sugar flowers. As the celebration got underway, Ezekiel and Miriam found themselves surrounded by well-wishers offering congratulations and advice. But it was Henry Two Rivers, the tribal scout, who had occasionally worked with Jacob as deputy, who provided the most meaningful blessing. "Jacob was my friend," he said, simply approaching the couple with dignity and grace. "He would be happy to know that his children will be raised by a man of honor. You have chosen well, Miriam Brandt." The use of her new name sent a thrill through Miriam. She was no longer Miriam Hale, widow and victim. She was Miriam Brandt, wife and mother, with a future full of possibilities. "Thank you, Henry," she said warmly. "Your friendship meant everything to Jacob, and it means everything to me." Henry nodded to Ezekiel. "The mountain teaches patience and strength. These children will learn well from you." As the afternoon wore on, people shared stories and laughter, while the babies were passed from hand to hand by the admiring women of the community. Miriam was amazed to see how readily the congregation had accepted not just her marriage to Ezekiel, but her daughters as well. These children, who had been seen as burdens and omens of bad luck just weeks before, were now being celebrated as the precious gifts they truly were. Dr. Morris, who had stayed in town to complete his official report, approached the couple during a quiet moment. "Mrs. Brandt," he said formally, "I wanted you to know that the territorial prosecutor is completely satisfied with the evidence in the Hale case. Thomas and Samuel will both stand trial for murder, and conviction is virtually certain." "What will happen to them?" Miriam asked. "Thomas will likely hang," Morris said bluntly. "He was the mastermind, and he showed no remorse for his actions. Samuel may receive a lesser sentence if he continues to cooperate with the prosecution, but he'll spend many years in territorial prison." Ezekiel nodded grimly. "Justice for Jacob." "Justice for Jacob," Morris agreed. "And protection for your family. With both brothers in custody, there's no one left to challenge your claim to the land or cause you further trouble." As evening approached and the celebration began to wind down, Ezekiel and Miriam prepared to leave for their new home. The ladies had packed baskets of food for them, and several men had loaded a wagon with wedding gifts, blankets, household items, and even a beautiful wooden cradle that old Pete had carved himself. "Where will you live?" Mrs. Patterson asked as they prepared to depart. "Ezekiel's cabin in the mountains," Miriam replied. "At least until we can build something larger on our land." "Our land," Ezekiel corrected gently. "Everything I have is yours now, just as everything you have is mine. We'll decide together where and how to build our future." The wagon ride to Ezekiel's mountain cabin took nearly 2 hours, following a winding trail that climbed steadily through pine forests and rocky outcroppings. The babies slept peacefully in their basket, lulled by the gentle motion of the wagon, while Miriam marveled at the beauty of the landscape that would be her new home. "It's magnificent," she said, as they emerged into a clearing that revealed a stunning view of the valley below. "I can see why you chose to live up here." "It's peaceful," Ezekiel agreed. "Good for thinking, for healing, but it's been lonely too. It won't be lonely anymore." The cabin itself was larger and more comfortable than Miriam had expected. Built of solid logs with a stone chimney and real glass windows, it felt like a home rather than just a shelter. Inside, she was pleased to discover that Ezekiel was a remarkably neat housekeeper. The main room contained a stone fireplace, a large wooden table, comfortable chairs, and shelves lined with books. "You read," Miriam observed with pleasure, examining the titles on his shelves. "Constantly," Ezekiel admitted. "It's one of the few luxuries I allow myself. I hope you don't mind sharing your husband with Shakespeare and Dickens occasionally." "Mind, I'm delighted. Jacob loved books too, but he never had as many as this." They spent the evening settling in with Ezekiel, showing Miriam around the cabin and explaining his daily routines. The bedroom was simple but comfortable, with a large bed covered in beautiful quilts that he admitted had been made by his late wife years earlier. "Does it bother you?" he asked gently, using things that belonged to her. Miriam considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "I think she would be glad to know they're being used to comfort another family, and I hope someday Sarah and Elizabeth will use them for their own children." That night, after the babies had been fed and settled in the beautiful wooden cradle that now sat beside their bed, Ezekiel and Miriam lay together as husband and wife for the first time. Their intimacy was gentle and tender, marked by the deep trust and affection that had grown between them over the past weeks. "Are you happy?" Ezekiel asked quietly as they held each other in the darkness. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Miriam replied honestly. "When I was being dragged through the streets by Thomas and Samuel, I thought my life was over. I couldn't imagine any future except poverty and shame. And now I see possibilities everywhere. A home to build children, to raise a community to be part of, a husband who chose to love me when he could have chosen anyone." "I chose the only woman I wanted," Ezekiel said firmly. "The only woman strong enough and brave enough to be my partner in this life." Over the following weeks, they established a routine that brought joy and purpose to each day. Ezekiel continued his trapping and lumber work, but now he had reasons to return home each evening beyond mere survival. Miriam threw herself into making the cabin a true home, cooking hearty meals, tending a small garden, and caring for the babies, who grew stronger and more alert each day. The twins began to show distinct personalities as they grew. Sarah was serious and observant, studying everything around her with intense concentration. Elizabeth was more social and expressive, smiling readily and making sounds that seemed like attempts at conversation. Both girls clearly adored their father, reaching for him whenever he entered the room and settling immediately when he held them. "They know you're their papa," Miriam observed one evening as she watched Ezekiel feeding Elizabeth while Sarah slept peacefully in his other arm. "And I know they're my daughters," he replied without hesitation. "I can't imagine loving them more if I'd been there at their birth." News from town reached them regularly through visitors and occasional trips to the settlement for supplies. Thomas Hale had been tried, convicted, and executed for the murder of his brother. Samuel had received a sentence of 20 years in territorial prison, but would likely serve less if he continued to cooperate with authorities investigating other suspicious deaths in the county. The revelation of the railroad development plans had created a stir throughout the territory. The Denver and Rio Grande had indeed been quietly acquiring land rights along their proposed route, and Jacob's property was now worth far more than anyone had imagined. But Ezekiel and Miriam agreed that they were in no hurry to sell. The land represented security for their daughter's future, and the spring would provide water for whatever they chose to build there. We could construct a proper house, Ezekiel suggested one autumn evening as they sat by the fire planning for the future. Something large enough for our family and any children we might have together. The possibility of more children was something they had discussed carefully. Miriam was still nursing the twins, but they both hoped to expand their family when the time was right. "I'd like that," Miriam said warmly. "I'd like Sarah and Elizabeth to have brothers and sisters to play with. And I'd like to raise children with you from the very beginning," Ezekiel admitted, "to be there for first steps and first words and all the milestones I missed with the girls." As winter approached, their little family settled into comfortable patterns of daily life. Ezekiel taught Miriam to shoot, insisting that a woman living in the mountains needed to be able to protect herself and her children. Miriam taught him some of the finer points of cooking and household management skills that improved their quality of life considerably. The babies thrived in the clean mountain air and loving environment. By their 6-month birthday, both girls were sitting up on their own and babbling constantly. Sarah had become particularly attached to a stuffed rabbit that Mrs. Patterson had made for her, while Elizabeth preferred a wooden rattle that Ezekiel had carved. "Look at them," Miriam said one snowy December morning as she watched Ezekiel playing with both babies on the rug in front of the fireplace. "They're so happy, so secure. They'll never remember being unwanted or threatened." "Good," Ezekiel said firmly, lifting Sarah high enough to make her squeal with delight. "They should never have to feel anything but loved and protected." As Christmas approached, the extended family of friends from Ironwood Crossing made the journey up the mountain to celebrate with them. Mrs. Patterson brought a feast worthy of a hotel dining room, while other families contributed gifts and good cheer. Even Sheriff Henderson made the trip, bringing official papers that formally documented Ezekiel's adoption of the twins. "Now it's legal as well as moral," he told them as he handed over the documents. "Ezekiel Brandt is officially the father of Sarah Elizabeth Brandt and Elizabeth Sarah Brandt. We switched their middle names," Miriam explained with a smile, "so each would carry her sister's name as well as her own." The symbolism was perfect. Two individuals bound together by love and family, just like the unusual family that had claimed them. That evening, after their guests had departed and the babies were asleep, Ezekiel and Miriam sat together by the dying fire, reflecting on how much their lives had changed. "A year ago," Miriam said quietly, "I was a pregnant widow facing an uncertain future. Tonight I'm surrounded by more love and security than I ever dreamed possible. A year ago I was a lonely hermit, convinced that family was something other people had." Ezekiel replied, "Tonight I have a wife who challenges me to be better than I thought I could be, and daughters who make every day worth living." "Do you ever regret it?" Miriam asked, "taking on so much responsibility so quickly?" Ezekiel turned to look at her, his pale blue eyes serious and certain. "Never, not for a single moment. You and the girls are the best thing that ever happened to me." As spring returned to the mountains, bringing with it the promise of new growth and fresh beginnings, the Brandt family began making concrete plans for their future. They would build their house on Jacob's land near the spring that had caused so much trouble, but would now provide life and prosperity for generations to come. Ezekiel hired workers from town to help with the construction, and by summer's end, a beautiful 2-story house stood where Jacob's simple cabin had once been. The house featured large windows that let in plenty of light, a modern kitchen that was Miriam's pride and joy, and a nursery large enough for the twins and any future siblings. On moving day, as they carried their belongings from the mountain cabin to their new home in the valley, Miriam paused to look back at the place where their family had truly begun. "Thank you," she said to the cabin that had sheltered them during their first months together. "Thank you for what," Ezekiel asked, following her gaze, "for giving us a place to fall in love, a place to become a real family." "We'll always have the cabin," he reminded her. "We can come back whenever we want to remember where it all started." The first night in their new house, they put the twins to bed in their beautiful new nursery and stood together at the window looking out over the land that was now truly theirs. The spring bubbled peacefully in the moonlight, and in the distance they could see the lights of Ironwood Crossing twinkling like earthbound stars. "I have something to tell you," Miriam said quietly, her hand resting on Ezekiel's arm. "What is it?" "I'm with child again, our child, due in the spring." Ezekiel's face lit up with joy so pure and bright that it took Miriam's breath away. "Are you certain?" "Completely certain. Are you pleased?" Instead of answering with words, he lifted her off her feet and spun her around, both of them laughing with delight. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'm more than pleased," he said softly. "I'm overwhelmed with gratitude for this life we've built together." As they settled into bed that night, Miriam reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had begun as a victim, been transformed into a survivor, and now stood as a woman who had claimed her own destiny. Her daughters would grow up knowing they were chosen, wanted, and fiercely protected. Her husband had proven that true strength lay not in dominating others, but in lifting them up. The mountain man who had stepped out of the shadows to declare, "I will be their father," had become exactly that, and so much more. He had become their salvation, their champion, their home. And tomorrow would bring new adventures for a family built not on accident or obligation, but on the unshakable foundation of love, freely given and joyfully received. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't over Thomas and Samuel Hale or the forces of greed and cruelty that had threatened to destroy them. The greatest victory was the family they had chosen to become, proof that love, courage, and unwavering commitment could triumph over any darkness, creating light that would shine for generations to come.